Okay, so here we are with I think this is our fourth presentation like this. So we're gonna do it in English again, but this time I have all the terms in French so that way you can see them, and I would like for you to take your notes in French. It might be some franglais, to be honest, so we'll just kind of see. But the reason I have them in French is because I'll be referring to them in French, and that way you kind of have some exposure to them outside of class, so that way when we're in class, you're not lost when I switch to French. So we're going to review direct and indirect object pronouns. These are things that we cover in French 3, so it is review, but we did practice them a lot, but we still just need more practice. And next week, we're going to be adding 2 new pronouns. So it's really important that we have these under our belt before we move on to the next ones. To be successful with object pronouns, we have to really study the grammar. And even though that's not always a fun topic, realistically, we don't have enough exposure with the language to say, oh, that sounds right. We also are going to make a lot of mistakes if we're just relying on English, because in English, our pronouns are a lot different than the French pronouns. So we really do need to analyze the grammar to make sure that we're accurate with our choice of pronoun. This will prevent you from saying things like, me go to the store, or saying things like, yeah, I like she. You know, we want to say I like her in French, and so we want to just make sure that we're making the appropriate choices. So terms that you need to know, which you in theory should know from English class, is a subject. A subject is not the topic of a sentence. Hopefully we're not still making that mistake. When we're talking about the subject, we're talking about the thing that does the action. It can be a person or a thing. Then, of course, the verb is the action. So then we have a direct object. A direct object is the person or the thing that receives the action directly. So notice a direct object can be a person or a thing, whereas an indirect object is the person who receives the action indirectly. So an indirect object is only a person, but people can be direct objects as well. So then that doesn't seem very clear to say directly or indirectly. So we can clear it up by saying that there's no preposition in front of an object that's direct. There's nothing blocking it. There's nothing in front of it. Whereas an indirect object is always preceded in French by the preposition a. So your key for an indirect object is a plus a person, or persons if it's plural. 2 other terms, just because when we get into some nitpicky grammar later on that I want you to know, is make sure you remember what a pronoun is. A pronoun replaces a noun. There's a difference between a direct object noun and a direct object pronoun. And then of course there's always an antecedent. This is one that students tend to forget about. An antecedent is what the pronoun's replacing. So if I said I like the cat and I replace it and say I like it, what's the antecedent for it? The cat. We need to review as well, because you know it, you just don't always have a name for it, is what are our 9 subject pronouns in French? I want you to see, you can hit pause and see if you can write them down without me showing them to you. So remember, the subject is what does the action. So what are the 9 words that do the actions in French? Je, tu, il, elle, on, nous, vous, il, elle. So remember that these are called subject pronouns, because they do the action and they replace the nouns. So here are just a couple of examples that should be very, very basic, and they're from French 1. La robe est chic. What if I wanted to replace this with a pronoun? Now notice that what's the verb? Is a. What's doing the is-ing? The dress. So elle est chic. It is chic. That first example is one that students tend to want to start to use object pronouns on, but remember, you still have to have a subject for every verb. Les musées de Paris sont excellents. If I wanted to replace les musées with a pronoun, it's doing the action, so I use ils. Ils sont excellents. And here's one that's more of an actual action. We see le singe a mangé la banane. That word singe is the word for monkey. So the monkey ate the banana. What ate the banana? The monkey. So it's a subject, il a mangé la banane. When we start studying object pronouns, students just want to throw them in everywhere, so we always have to go back and review the basics. It's not a bad idea. Oh, and one more, je veux réussir à ce cours. Now this is a mistake that we'll tend to make, but I want to emphasize that we've used the word je. You know, there's also a couple words for, and same thing in English, for the word me. So how come it's not me want, but I want? it's because I am doing the action. So this is the same thing here. Notice that we use je veux because I am doing the action versus me or moi because we're not receiving the action here. So let's get into our direct and indirect object pronouns then. So what are the 7 direct object pronouns? Me, te, nous, vous, and le, la, and le. I want you to pay special attention here that only le and la change to L apostrophe in front of a vowel. Le never contracts. The plural trumps everything. And then what are your 6 indirect object pronouns? They are me, te, nous, vous again, and then lui and le. Notice that with lui and le, there's no distinction between masculine and feminine. Also, note that the direct and indirect object pronouns for the first and second person are exactly the same. Me, te, nous, vous. So anytime the first or second person is receiving the action, whether it be directly or indirectly, it's the exact same word, so it makes it a lot easier for us. So let's see how we actually use these in a sentence. Start with the present tense, and we're going to start with direct objects here. So we see Claire achète des chaussures. We find our verb achète. Who's doing the action? Claire is, so she's the subject. And what is she buying? She's buying shoes. So les chaussures becomes my direct object. It's easy to find the direct object if you ask yourself who or what is the verb doing. So what is Claire buying? Shoes. That's my direct object. So I would use the subject, I would use the object pronoun les, and notice that it goes in front of the verb. This is where placement is incredibly important for French because it doesn't read the same as English. And we would say Claire les achète. I don't know why I have to click on the next one to get it to go blue, but I want you to see, keep looking at that. Claire les achète. And we see that the les is in front. Okay. Notice I didn't use il or elle as a subject pronoun because the shoes aren't buying. Claire is buying. And what is Claire buying? The shoes. She's buying them. Claire les achète. So let's look at this next example because we have 2 different objects off the sentence. Je lis ta lettre à Marie. So we find our verb lis, reading. Who's doing the reading? I am. What am I reading? The letter. And to whom am I reading it? To Marie. So which of these is the direct object? Well, the direct object doesn't have anything in front of it, whereas an indirect object will have that preposition a in front of it. So my direct object is ta lettre. If I wanted to replace this with a pronoun, I'm going to pick la, and notice that it goes in front of the verb. Je la lis à Marie. Here we're going to see a negative example. So we know that the pronoun goes in front of the verb. What about when it's negated? Il n'écoute jamais Madame Dupont. Here, Madame Dupont is the direct object. Now remember, people can be direct objects. He never listens to Madame Dupont. In English, this sounds like an indirect object, but in French, it's a direct object. So where is this going to go? Il ne l'écoute jamais. Notice that my pronoun has changed to L apostrophe in front of a vowel, and notice that it goes around, the ne and jamais go around the pronoun and the verb. It hugs everything. It still has only gone around one conjugated verb, okay? But we have the pronoun in there. And one last example using the me, te, nous, vous. Mes parents vous invitent à la maison. So the object pronoun here is vous, because who is doing the inviting? My parents are. And who is receiving the invitation? Y'all are. So mes parents vous invitent. So notice that the ent ending is agreeing with the subject. And je te cherche depuis des heures. So we would say je te cherche, I've been looking for you. Notice that we don't use tu because you're not doing the looking, I am, and you are receiving my looking. So let's look at a couple of examples of an indirect object pronoun. Nous écrivons au président. This is one where that au is going to be very important because we have a plus a person. So we're writing to the president. The to then means that it is an indirect object pronoun. So we're going to replace it with lui. Nous lui écrivons. We are writing to him. Let's look at this exact same example as before. Je lis ta lettre à Marie. But this time, instead of replacing the direct object, let's replace the indirect object. So we already identified je as the subject, ta lettre as the direct object. And Marie is the indirect object because of the So I am reading your letter to Marie. So we could replace this by saying I'm reading the letter to her. And notice that Marie is replaced with lui. There's no distinction between gender with lui. Il n'obéit jamais à ses parents. Here's another negative example. This time we're going to replace this with an indirect object because of the preposition à. He never obeys his parents. In French we say he never obeys to his parents. So that makes it indirect, and we would say il ne leur obéit jamais. Notice here that the ne jamais goes around the verb, but it also encompasses the pronoun. Two examples using mot à nouveau. Vous m'envoyez un cadeau. Notice here that you are doing the sending. You are sending a gift. And to whom are you sending the gift? To me. So in this particular case, me is an indirect object. It does matter if you can identify mot à nouveau as direct or indirect as when we get to the passé composé. Il nous parle. Notice that he is doing the talking and we are receiving that talking. He's talking to us. If you're having a hard time distinguishing between deciding whether nous or mot à nouveau is direct or indirect, you can always use a third person and rewrite the sentence, and that would tell you. So if we wanted to say il parle, if he's talking to Paul, we would put in that preposition because we would say il parle à Paul, not il parle Paul. So that is one way of helping you decide if mot à nouveau is direct or indirect. A couple of things to note is that sometimes in French, the verb requires a direct object, whereas in English it's indirect, or vice versa. So if you look at these three verbs, chercher, écouter, or attendre, all of these verbs require a direct object in French, whereas if you were to translate them into English, you would notice that they require a preposition. Whereas opposite of that, ressembler and téléphoner both require the preposition à in French. In French, we resemble to a person, or we telephone to a person. Whereas in English, those verbs. So that's really the difference between direct and indirect, as well as placement. So we're going to look at two more slides that will review where we put the pronoun in the sentence. Now the direct and indirect object go in front of the verb. But when we have a verb plus infinitive, it looks a little bit different. Nous pouvons voir les statues. We would say nous pouvons les voir. So notice here that it would go in front of the infinitive, so a slightly different placement. But one way to think about it that would help you is that the object pronoun goes in front of the verb of which it's an object. So instead of saying we can them, we're saying we can see them. And so that's what's important to look at. So we can also see it here, je veux te voir. Notice that the te goes in front of the infinitive voir, because do I want you or do I want to see you? And that's an important distinction to note. Tu vas vendre ta voiture? We would say je ne vais pas la vendre. Notice that the la goes in front of the infinitive. We can still negate the first verb. Remember that ne pas only goes around one conjugated verb. And here's one other example. Notice that we have a preposition in between the two verbs, but the rule is still the same, that the pronoun goes in front of the verb of which it's an object. So I would say nous venons de le voir. We just came from seeing it. Did we come in or did we see it? We see it. And so we're going to put the le in front of voir. Notice here that the de doesn't make a contraction with le because this particular le is not an article, but it's an object pronoun. So the same reasoning applies to the indirect object pronouns. So let's just look at more examples. Ils doivent parler à madame. We would say ils ne doivent pas lui parler. Notice that the lui goes in front of parler because that is the verb of which it's an object. Okay, they don't have to talk to her. Vas-tu offrir un cadeau à tes parents? Je vais leur offrir des fleurs. Notice that leur goes in front of offrir because we are offering to them. We're not going to them. And same thing, another example, nous voulons vous écrire, we want to write to you. And so the vous belongs to them. So that's one area where we have to pay attention to placement. And now we're going to look at the passé composé. There's two things that happen with the passé composé. Remember, passé composé is two parts, a helping verb plus a past participle. So the